Robert Hudson, August 24th, 1992. Location, the North Brevard Historical Museum, Titusville, Florida. Interviewed by Nancy Yasecko. Equipment, camera, Sony BVP-50. Beta SP recorder, Sony BVW-35. Audio will be found on channels 2 and 4. Copyright Brevard County Historical Commission, 1992.
Okay, we'll start with your general origins. Where and when you were born, when your family came to this place.
Well, I was born in 1920 in Des Moines, Iowa, and moved to Titusville from Cleveland, Ohio in 1925. My family was all from Iowa, and my dad was in the newspaper business, and he came down here and bought the newspaper in Titusville, the Star Advocate. And we came down a couple months later in the height of the mosquito season, and we had a lot of mosquitoes, and that was unusual for us from Cleveland, Ohio. But and I lived here ever since 1925. Went to school here and on up to the University of Florida, and then in the Navy, and then back here in 1948. I've been here ever since.
So your father was involved in the newspaper business. What did he find when he came here?
Well, he was used to working with the Scripps Howard people in both Des Moines and Cleveland, and he came down here and bought a little paper, a little once-a-week newspaper. But he's always wanted he always wanted to own his own newspaper, and he heard about this, so he came down and bought it, and then I followed in his footsteps. I was the first newspaper delivery person, and learned everything from how to set type and everything on up to when I came back in 1948. I became editor and then publisher in 1972 after his death. So I spent a lot of time with this paper and in Titusville. It's been my love.
How did y'all collect the news around here?
Just going and talking to people and covering events. And we didn't have many reporters, of course, in the early days, maybe one, maybe two. And we just go attend meetings and interview people, go to events. You know, there were a different way of collecting news in those days than there is now, because we didn't have just strictly a local paper, and we didn't have the National Wire Service or anything. Didn't pay attention to that. We let people take the big daily papers for that. We just told the story of the folks of North Brevard, how they lived and where they went, and you know, even a visit to Orlando was worth a little personal item in the paper, and that's the way we did it.
Okay. What was transportation like when you came here?
Well, when we came here, of course, the roads weren't nearly as good as they are now. The railroad was the important transportation link. The railroads came into this area in 1885 when they connected the St. Johns River with the Indian River, and that was the chief mode of transportation. And then in 1892, I think it was, Henry Flagler brought his railroad down the East Coast. And that was a major accomplishment, because then we had transportation for the orange, for the citrus industry going north, transportation for the fishing industry going north, and tourist transportation.
Okay, hold on just
Prior.
Hang on just a second. I'm getting a blinky here. That was it. Okay, we were talking about the roads.
Yeah, the roads were pretty poor at that day and age. Of course, they called it the Dixie Highway long before it was US 1 through this area. That was the main connecting area, north and south. And of course, we had the road over to Orlando, which was built in 1922, and each of the counties built the road to the St. Johns River, and for a while they had a ferry go across, but then they eventually built a bridge. And another road of importance was the one from Mims west to Sanford. That was called the Orlando Highway, the Anderson Highway at one time. Those were important east-west roads, but we were all connected by US 1 pretty much. Prior to that, transportation had been by boat up and down the Indian River, and then the railroad, of course, came along. So transportation was not the best when we came. Most of the freight was brought by railroad, of course. We didn't have the big trucks we have today. But eventually they came along in four-laned US 1, and of course we've gotten I-95 and a lot of difference.
I can only imagine. Were there a lot of automobiles here?
Well, when we got here, there were a number, but not like this today, of course. But for the population, I think there were a good percentage of the population had automobiles. To be able to go where you wanted to go, we didn't have a lot of shopping facilities back in when we came here in 1925. So some major shopping was done in Orlando and maybe Daytona Beach also. So it was necessary to have a car if you wanted to do any of that shopping.
Did most people have boats?
Quite a number did, but those were mostly for pleasure by this time. By the time we came here in the 20s, very little transportation was necessary by boat because it was so easy to jump in a car or get on the train. Train was very important. We had a lot of passenger service, and it used to be quite a thing for example, school children in elementary schools in Cocoa to get on a train, and then their parents would meet them here and take them back, or Titusville students would ride to Cocoa. They have that experience of riding on a train. I did quite a bit of that back in those days because it was something to get on a train.
Yeah. Which early businesses do you recall?
Well, let's talk a little bit about maybe the industry first. The citrus business was important to this area. This is the beginning of the famous Indian River citrus area. We're at the north end of that. And Turnbull Hammock north of us was a great place for citrus. Then the fishing industry was very important. There was a lot of fishing done in the Indian River, commercial fishing, and a lot of fish was shipped out of here. Those were our two biggest industries, and really the only industries until World War II came along, and we had a boat building industry that moved in the latter part of the 1930s, and operated during World War II here. And then, of course, the Patrick Air Force Base, which was Banana River Naval Air Station, of course, that came in, and that brought some people here, not much effect. And of course, then after the missile business started, Titusville started booming, North Brevard started booming. Early businesses, we had our share of grocery stores. A&P store came in quite early, and then Piggly Wiggly, which has since gone to become Winn-Dixie. They were here. We had local merchant stores, a few clothing stores, that type of store. Denham's department store was an early store here. A drugstore was established in, probably one of the best ones was established in 1912 when Dr. Spell moved to Titusville. He was a doctor and a pharmacist both, and he also operated a drugstore. If you can remember the little round tables with the chairs that were made of iron or metal, with the little attractive little chairs, and the marble top counter. We used to have a lot of fun at the local drugstore. Those were the main things. We had an early bank. And first bank was established in 1888, and then another bank was established in 1912. And we did have banks. Both of them failed during the Depression, in the early days of the Depression, so we had no banking in North Brevard. The only bank in the county that was open was in Cocoa. And so we did our banking in Cocoa. And that was sort of a trial to think about banking that far away.
Also on the topic of businesses, I understand there were a few saloons in.
Oh yes, there were a few saloons. We had our share of saloons. It is said that, excuse me, way back in, in the days before railroads came and so forth, that Titusville had 7 saloons and no churches. And so Mrs. Titus was responsible for asking the captains of the steamboats, with the paddle wheel steamboats that went up and down the Indian River, if they could put a basket for donations, asking donations. There was a little sign there that's saying that Titusville had 7 saloons and no churches, and wouldn't you help donate for church? And that's the way the money arrived for the first church that was built, St. Gabriel's Episcopal Church, and then be followed by the First Presbyterian Church and some other churches. But that was we did have a lot of saloons. It was sort of a wild town for a while, I think. It was a lot of, that was a little bit before my time, but even during the 1920s and 30s, we had 3 or 4 saloons or bars, as they became known, right in the 1-block area of Washington Avenue, right downtown.
One of the businesses.
One of the businesses, that's true. That's where I learned to shoot pool in one of them. They had a pool hall right behind one. And all the kids in town, you know, they didn't have the regulations back then about you had to be 18 years old or 21 years old to enter the doors. You could enter the doors, they wouldn't serve you anything, but you could enter the doors to play pool, and that's where there was usually always a few pool tables were accompanied in a bar, most always.
Where did you and your family make most of your purchases?
Well, we tried to buy all we could in Titusville. Naturally, we were in the business of newspaper business, and they were our advertisers, and so we believed in trading at home as all we could. Unfortunately, there are a few things that you couldn't buy in Titusville. For example, just personally, I have a very narrow foot, and I couldn't buy shoes. I either had to order them or go to Orlando to buy shoes. It was quite difficult. There were things like that we didn't have in Titusville, but generally you would buy most everything, most of your clothing and other things here, buy your cars in Titusville. And so we shopped primarily in Titusville area. I think most people did. Their specialty purchases had to be made out of town because we didn't have the stores that we have and we gained after the missile, the space launch came to this area.
Who were the early professionals that you recall?
Oh, I can recall, of course, the first doctor in this area was Dr. Holmes, but he was gone by the time we moved here. But some of the early professionals, Dr. Lichtenberger, who was a dentist. He was the only dentist we had in town for years and years. And he had an office on the 2nd floor of a building, Washington Avenue, and you could sit in the chair and look down Washington Avenue, which was an interesting thing, a little bit like maybe having it and overlooking the Indian River, but you could see all the traffic on Washington Avenue. Dr. Adams was one of the early doctors here, and Dr. McLeod. We had Dr. McLeod and Dr. Ferguson were involved in trying to form a small hospital here in the early days. And they ran a hospital. It only had 3 or 4 beds, something like that, and it was very difficult. Because if you only had 1 or 2 doctors, it was quite difficult to make sure that the hospital was properly run. So we had those health facilities early, and then didn't have any health facilities for many years. And then finally, in the 1950s, we established a North Brevard District Hospital, which has become Parish Medical Center. But it's said that so many babies were born. Their birth was in either Cocoa or in Orlando primarily, even though they were Brevard County residents. They were born there because that was where the doctors were in the hospital. And there were a number of babies born in back seats of automobiles on their way to Orlando, too, over a period of years.
I can imagine. Would you like a drink of water? We're doing a lot of talking.
Yeah, let me get a sip of water and I'll put it.
The other professionals that were here.
Okay, yeah, other than doctors and dentists, well, I think of other professionals being lawyers and judges. Of course, Titusville is a county seat of Brevard County, a 72-mile county, and the county seat way up here in the north end of it. So we did, a lot of our life revolved around the courthouse, around politics, and the major trials were held here. And there have been a lot of very interesting people, professionals. There was one named Circuit Judge Minor Jones, who in the course of, they had some problems about seasons for fishing for mullet. And if you know, the mullet is a fish that eats the grasses. It is not a carnivorous fish. I think that's pronounced right, I'm not sure, but anyway, it doesn't eat other sea life. And so, and it has according to the regulations, it has a gizzard. So what Miner Jones did, because they were fishing, you know, there was some question, and some fishermen were pulled up for fishing out of season. He made a decision that the mullet was not a fish, but it was a fowl because it had a gizzard. And so this is still on the statute books today, this ruling that mullet is not a fish, it's a fowl, it has a gizzard, and that's where the name Indian River chicken comes from. And so that's just a story. He was a character, and we've had our other characters. One strong judge that we had here for many years was Judge Millard Smith. Of course, these people are all dead now, but Judge Smith was a long-time circuit judge here, very well respected, very highly respected, presided at, he was the only circuit judge we had, so he presided at all of the trials of any major consequence. And we had one of the best defense lawyers in this area was from Cocoa, Colonel Noah Butt. And he's very highly regarded. He probably defended most of the people who were involved with major crimes. He was very colorful, always was dressed in a white suit and had a white hat most of the time, not in court, of course. And he did a very good job. He was very well respected. He also served in the legislature. And then we had our number of colorful sheriffs. Sheriffs were thought to be the most dominant person in most counties in Florida at that day and age. Sheriffs were very powerful. And we had a number of sheriffs going way back to Sheriff Brown and Sheriff Doolittle, and then later on Sheriff Roberts, Roy Roberts, who homesteaded on North Merritt Island. He was a sheriff here for a while and later was our state representative. And we come up to our present Jake Miller as our sheriff. But we had a lot of strong sheriffs over the period of time. We had a lot of strong county officials. Matt Simmons was a county clerk for many years, and prior to him, a man by the name of A.A. Stewart. And they were very, very well liked, very well respected. They're in charge of all the records for the courts, and it was very important that they be good people and pay attention to their jobs. So we had a lot of politicians. More recent ones, one of the more recent ones that I can think of is the late Max Brewer. He was a little younger than I am, but he died in an airplane crash. But he was our state representative for a while, and then became very closely associated with former Governor Ferris Bryant, was on the State Road Board. And it was through Max Brewer's efforts that we, for example, had US 1, the four-laning of US 1 completed through the county. It was done partially, but he got it completed, and it was during his term as a State Road Board member that we had I-95 laid out, and the first construction was done along I-95. So we owe a lot to people like that who were good leaders, and we always thought that if Max Brewer had lived, he probably would have run for governor someday. Another very strong person was a man by the name of J.J. Parrish, very much associated with the Indian River citrus and Parrish Groves. It's quite a historic family in the citrus industry. He was president of the Senate at one time and was a very powerful political figure. One of his sons followed him as a state senator here, Bernard Parrish, and so that family contributed much to our community as far as in the area of being professional people. Beyond that, we've had a number of very colorful lawyers and judges and other office holders, but they've been very important to Titusville and the North Brevard area because of the relationship with the courthouse being here. That was one of the biggest industries, if you want to say an industry, the courthouse was. And of course, in recent years, we've lost some of that, but now they're redoing the courthouse here, and we'll probably continue with more of this life.
How many courthouse buildings have there been?
Well, the original courthouse was a two-story white wooden building that came in the early 1880s. then it was followed, because it was a wooden building and they realized that it was, records would be more subject to fire, they built a one-story just records building nearby. And then that courthouse was replaced in 1912 by a courthouse that's still standing. It's the one that's has the tall pillars in front of it on Palm Avenue. That is still standing. It was added to several times, and then they built the new 6-story primary steel constructed building. That's the one that's being redone now, completely redone, and people will be moving back into it within a year. So we've had really 3 courthouses. That one of them is only there. The 2 are still here, and the one built in 1912 is a historic building.
Okay. What you're describing is a place that has developed a lot in a relatively short period of time.
Well, we don't have the history that places in the New England states or elsewhere in the North has, but we do have some history of families and people who were here back in those days. But the town didn't grow much. It was it stayed relatively the same for a number of years. However, you would never have believed it if you read some of the proclamations that Colonel Henry Titus and some of the other people made back then, that this was the grand and glorious place for tourism, and it was. It was a big tourist stop before the railroad came through and the development went down the East Coast. This was a much bigger tourist area for a number of years before Miami, for example, was established. And there was no way to get to Miami except by boat, of course. But here we did have the transportation by rail from the St. Johns River over here. And then, of course, the railroad coming down this way was developed in stages, so that Titusville still maintained quite a tourist industry for a number of years. It's still a tourist stop, and of course that's because of the Space Center and the Kennedy Space Center and the Visitor Information Center. That is quite a bit of tourism here at that time.
People used to come down to go hunting and fishing.
Oh yes, North Merritt Island was just a great place to hunt and fish. Fishing was big in the Indian River, and the surf fishing was not as great in those days as it is now. A lot of people surf fish, but they didn't do that too much, and we didn't have a lot of commercial fishing in the ocean. The commercial fishing was in the Indian River. But there was a lot of fishing, and people came to hunt and fish. And then a lot of people were told, maybe like in more recent years, they would go to Arizona for their sinuses or for respiratory problems. They were asked to come south to get away from influenza and other respiratory problems. And Titusville had quite a bit of tourism from that, the health reasons. I don't know, they came down here and were eaten up by mosquitoes in the summertime, but most tourists came in the wintertime.
I guess like they still do.
They still do. That's right.
Okay, we're getting near the end of this tape, so we'll stop and put another tape in.
We were talking about tourism, and tourism resulted in a number of hotels being built in Titusville. The railroad terminated after Flagler came in. The railroad station was at the west end of Julia Street, which was only about a 5-block street. At the east end of Julia Street was the Titus House, built by Colonel Titus, and that was subsequently replaced by the Indian River Hotel, then later the Dixie Hotel. In between those two, there were a number of small hotels. They probably we think of them today as rooming and boarding houses, but there were a number of small hotels, all of them offering food and dining areas and so forth. But there were a lot of hotels in this area, nothing big and glamorous, but small ones. And speaking of hotels, let me say a little bit about when Flagler did bring the railroad in. I don't know, I can't vouch for this story in the 1890s, but he apparently wanted to purchase a large tract of land, which we now know as Sand Point in Titusville. And he had said that he wanted to put a hotel on it, but the man who owned it wouldn't sell it to him because he was afraid that it would become a freight yards, freight transfer yards, so he wouldn't sell. So there was a story that Henry Flagler said, well, he'd make Titusville a whistle stop or a flag stop, and but he didn't. He built the stations here and everything, and we had the same service everybody else did. But the story is he took his hotels on down to the Palm Beach area, which he probably would have done anyway. But that's one of the little sidelight stories of perhaps this might have been a little more of a tourist area if we'd had Flagler Hotel here, for example.
There are a couple of restaurants I think of when I think of Titusville. I don't know how historical they are. What about the restaurants in this area?
Well, there were some early restaurants, but nothing. They were more mom and pop type restaurants. I think that the Dixie Hotel had a very good dining room, as an example, and billiard parlor along with it. Most of the hotels had their own dining rooms. Restaurants came in later on, I would say much later, restaurants of significance. And of course, today we have very good restaurants, I think, and particularly with the seafood and with views on the Indian River. That's an important thing.
Yeah. Attractions. I mean, we talked about the health factors being an attraction. Were there other attractions?
I think the weather, pretty good weather here. Maybe not as good as we might find on down to Miami, not quite as warm a winter time. But the weather was a big attraction, the fishing, hunting, and I will tell you about a hunting club that was here that might be interesting. It was even not in operation, but available after we came here. And this was founded by 10 graduates of Harvard University in 1890. And they hunted the country over, they said, for a good hunting lodge. And they located and purchased 18,000 acres of land behind what is now the property owned by NASA for Kennedy Space Center. And they founded a 20-room hunting lodge, and these were very prominent names, people, Vanderbilts and other people from the east. The hunting lodge was opened in about 1891 and operated till 1922, and then was put on caretaker status. During that time, it is claimed that 4 presidents who were in office at the time visited there and hunted there. Now, when we came here, the clubhouse was still there, and we were allowed with the caretaker to see the clubhouse. In that day and age, of course, they did their trophies were on the walls. They did the heads of all the animals of many of the animals, and so they brought a taxidermist with them to do this. And so the main room of that 20-room building was just covered. The walls were covered with the heads of bears and deer and so forth, all types of animals.
Okay, let's cut.
Interview with Robert Hudson, August 24th, 1992, North Brevard Historical Museum, Titusville, Florida. Interviewer Nancy Yasecko. Equipment camera Sony BVP50, Beta SP recorder Sony BVW35, audio channels 2 and 4, copyright Brevard County Historical Commission 1992.
Okay, this is Robert Hudson, take 2.
Yes, we were talking about the Canaveral Club and the Harvard graduates that came down here. Among the presidents that we know that visited the club and hunted there was Grover Cleveland. We have some pictures of his party. Others that they've said, and this was before my time, was Howard Taft and Theodore Roosevelt were among the ones, and I could believe that they were both outdoor people, so they both might well have come here, particularly with the influential people who owned the club. The club was, as I stated before, was in operation until 1922, went on caretaker status, then was sort of let go over a number of years. And when NASA bought the property, the clubhouse had burned down, but there were still some outbuildings there. by the way, they had the first swimming pool in this section. They built a swimming pool, and all the transportation over to that area, which was near the Atlantic Ocean, but on a little part of Banana Creek, all the transportation was by boat. So they had to take all their cement and all their supplies and everything over that way. The main clubhouse was burned down, and then when NASA bought the property, the rest of it was torn down, and this is about where Pad 39B is now, approximately in that area, not right over the area, but in that area. They had to pump up quite a bit of ground and so forth for the Pad 39B, but that's where it was located, in that area. So those were the most famous people, I guess, that we had visit here in the early days. Of course, later on, Franklin Roosevelt, when he was president, he visited it here. He came from Orlando by automobile and caught his special train here, and that was a big event. They had a parade while he was here and everything. That was in the 30s. So I guess those were the most important people that we might say that visited here or spent any time here as tourists.
When they did the hunting, what kind of things did they hunt?
Well, North Merritt Island was just had all kinds of wildlife: bear, deer, panthers, wildcat, a lot of deer were here at that time. And there were all types of, most types of animals that you would find in America, foxes, and the Florida panther was pretty prevalent in those day and age on North Merritt Island. Of course, today we don't have too many. Those we have a lot of alligators, and of course they had a lot of alligators in that day and age too. But they came for that type of hunting.
Okay. Oops, sorry. You went to school here. You started.
Sure did. Yeah, I started here 1925, really 26. I started here and graduated in 1938 from Titusville High School. Saw the school grow. In fact, it was after we got here that they built a separate building for Titusville High. When we came, I started school in a building that's where City Hall is now located. It was a 3-story building and housed all 12 grades of the high school. And the gymnasium was, strangely enough, was on the 3rd floor. It was a big, nice, roomy rooms, tall ceilings. You opened the windows and the breeze would flow through. We had no air conditioning in that day and age, of course. That's where I went my first 6 years of school. And then in 1927 and 28, they built Titusville High School, which is down on the present side of Titusville High School. It was a Spanish-type building, and I went there 6 years. And saw a lot of changes over a period of time, from athletics to scholastic endeavors and the types of education. We didn't seem to worry too much about the lack of courses, because we always had courses available that were sufficient that we could get into college. And we didn't have the type of tests they have now to get into college, because colleges weren't as crowded in that day and age. But
what was a school day like for a schoolboy?
Well, in elementary school, of course, you didn't go as early as they go nowadays. You went to school a little later in the day. We'd go about 8 o'clock and not be through school till 3 or 3:30. But if we remember that at this time, a great many of the students came from outlying areas by bus, and there was always a little bit of conflict between the city folks and the country folks. A little bit of that went on in elementary school in particular. We had a cafeteria, and very few people brought their lunches. They usually would buy lunch for about 15 cents in the early part of this. Those of us who lived in town many times just walked home and ate at noon, because we'd have an hour, and we'd walk home and eat lunch at home and then walk back. Or maybe if in later days, if someone had a car, we'd ride home and ride back. But it was about the same as anybody else went to school. We didn't have a one-room schoolhouse. Of course, we had separate rooms for separate classes. And today, I can say that my first grade teacher is still alive and spends the winters here. My third grade teacher lives here, and my fifth grade teacher lives here. So I'm real proud of the fact that I went to school here. And then life was good. I went on to University of Florida and graduated from there. But I'm a product of Brevard County education, and I'm proud of it. My interest in education continued through the years, and I was on the Brevard School Board for 14 years, chairman for 9 of those years. So I've had a real interest in education in Brevard. In fact, I was on the school board during the heavy buildup of the space program, when we were finishing a classroom a week, averaging that for a number of years. And in fact, we had as many students when I got off the board as we have today, about 60,000. And then of course with the fallback of the Apollo program, you know, we lost a lot of people. And then these people who came in the early buildup grew older, and their children graduated from schools. So we had a number of schools that were empty and were either sold or used for other purposes. Now it's building back up to the same number of students in that day and age. But there's a lot of interest in education, and I've always had a lot of interest in it, and I've always been proud of our schools. Some people say you can't get a proper education in the schools of Brevard, and particularly in the early days. We never found that to be any different than it is today. It's in the person. If they want the education, they can get it.
It leads me to come to the notion of what it was like during the integration years here.
Well, we didn't have the problems of integration that many other areas had, many other states perhaps. Florida had a law, with a lot of others, and I was on the board at the time, the school board at the time, a law that you upheld the separate but equal philosophy for the black students and the white students. And if you failed to do that, then you could be removed from office. That was part of the Constitution of the state of Florida. After the Brown decision in the 50s, then we gradually worked toward integration. We could not accomplish it until we went till federal court ordered it. So I was on the board when the federal court, we were in court in Orlando, and federal court required us for integration, and it was at that time then that overturned the regulation in the Constitution of the state of Florida, and so then we could proceed with integration. We had some few troubles, but not in the schools. We had, you know, there were maybe some kids would argue with one another, maybe get in a fight or two, but we never had anything like you know, a big upheaval or anything like that. Integration, I think, in Brevard went rather smoothly, particularly in the schools. And I think it was because we had good teachers, good black and white teachers both, who accepted it and moved forward with it, and good administrators that said, this is the law, we're going to do it. And the philosophy was that we should make the equal education for everybody, because the separate but equal was really not separate but equal. There was no way it was separate but equal. Facilities may have been separate but equal, but you had to put the money into the schools. And I was so glad when we did away with black schools, we'll say, and integrated. We did use some of the facilities in the black schools for integrated schools, but most of them were in the other buildings, the white buildings. I think it went pretty smooth, really, the whole problem of integration in Brevard.
There was a black community here right from the beginning.
Oh yes, we've had a black community, and if you look back on it, we throw up our hands and just think, how could we treat people like that, of not having equal facilities for schooling? But that was the way it was in those days, and that's not making an excuse. It's just that was the way life was. We had separate. In fact, the building that was replaced in 1916 by the big concrete building where City Hall is now. The old wooden building was moved and became one of the early schools for blacks in the community. That was in 1916. But prior to that, most of the education for blacks was on an informal basis by those blacks who were determined that their children were going to get an education. In some instances, they were educated in churches or educated in homes, maybe out underneath an oak tree, but they didn't have the facilities. And it wasn't until a few years before integration that the facilities began to be built for the black students. And we did have some good facilities for them, but they just couldn't get the same education. There were so much fewer in number that you couldn't offer higher forms of math, geometry, trigonometry. The students just were not there to offer it. Mm. But I think generally the relationship between the blacks and whites in Brevard has been pretty smooth over a period of years, and it continues to be a good, strong point.
Are there any prominent black folks that were involved with the city government, county government?
Well, one of the earliest black residents was a man named Gibson, and Mr. Gibson came here in the way back before Colonel Titus was here. He was here, and he was very dedicated to education for the young blacks. He also ran one of the early restaurants here. He was the first jailer, first county jailer here, and was a very prominent person, Andrew J. Gibson. Another man was Henry Maxwell, who was an early citrus grower and owned some groves, and very prominent. Those were some of the earlier prominent blacks. We've got others in more recent years, and one that we have had for a number of years is Dr. Frank Williams, who is now chairman of the board of trustees at Brevard Community College, and worked with the Peace Corps under President Kennedy. He did that overseas. He has been on staff of President Eisenhower and on the staff of working with President Nixon and other presidents over a period of time. So we're very proud of Dr. Williams.
Great. Can we cut for a second? Let him get. We'll talk a little bit more about the relationship between black people and white people in those days.
Well, one thing, we were in Titusville, North Brevard, as with many places, we didn't have plantations. We didn't have that holdover, for example, of the slave times, which I'm sure was a very difficult thing in the Carolinas, in Georgia, and across the South. We didn't have that type of thing here. But many of our young people were raised, practically raised by black women. There's no question about it. For example, in my own family, my two daughters, we had a black woman that was there at the house with them when they were young, and my wife was working. Later on, after they went to school, she was always there when they got home in school. We just demanded that she eat with them when she did the cooking for them, and that she'd eat with them, and then oftentimes she'd bring her small daughter, and they would sit together and eat. We never thought anything about it. That was just part of our life. There was no black and white. We didn't even think of that. It was friends. We were friends. And I think a lot of people in the North Brevard area felt the same way. There was no question about it. The problem of the blacks in the community there was the jobs. And they were pretty much in the earlier days relegated to citrus picking and that type, janitorial work and so forth. And it wasn't until later on that we got the professional black that we have today. And it's a real heartening to see that they took advantage of their education. And that's what the advantage of integrated education.
Okay. We'll roll on to the social life and entertainment.
Well, entertainment probably revolved mostly around the movie theater. The church was strong for not entertainment exactly, except that you did have programs and plays and entertainment. The theater, the Magnolia Theater, which is now the Emma Parrish Theater, It was a very early theater, and they had a lot of movies, of course. But there were the number of dances. They would have dances and school programs, church programs. Of course, I think life revolved around the school and church more in those days than it does now. But that's where entertainment was primarily. We made our own entertainment. When I was young, we didn't have any Little League or things like that, and we would find a vacant lot and go out and cut the weeds ourselves and maybe use stones for the bases and play baseball. And it was just, that was what you did. I can remember when I lived just a block off of Indian River Avenue, and the traffic was so light that we would extend a tennis net across Indian River Avenue and play tennis, and when a car came, we'd take down one side of the net, and then we'd go back to playing tennis. Didn't have any backdrops. If the ball went by us, we had to chase it down the street, which was paved at that time. But we did a lot of things like that, and then, of course, a lot of young men enjoyed fishing and hunting in that day and age. But entertainment revolved around, as I said, the family and the schools. And then we had a number of musical programs here. A woman by the name of Mrs. Pritchard, Mrs. D.B. Pritchard, was very involved in the production of several musical programs and plays each year. And she was very good about that, and she was very dedicated to that. And she loved young people. And so we had an awful lot of that type of entertainment, plays, programs, and that type of thing that she would direct because she had such an interest in young people.
I have a note here. May Day picnics, were there?
Oh, well, that's right, entertainment. Well, we had May Day here, as you might know. The May Day was a big thing for the Maypole dance, and you always had that. That was primarily relegated to the school students. There was entertainment in the area during holiday celebrations. Those were quite popular, and it appeared that there were only three centers in those days. There were only three centers of population of any size. There was the Melbourne, O'Galley area, and the Cocoa Rockledge area, and Titusville area, and so each of these three areas sponsored celebrations on holidays. Titusville's time was on the 4th of July. And people from throughout the county would come, either by car or they would bring their boats, and they had boat races, and they had parades, and they had greased pig, try to catch the greased pig or climb the greased pole, and they had, at one stage we had horse races, and these were just horses, that farmers used, horse races over a small area of track. But most of it revolved around the Indian River, and there were sailboat and powerboat races. Melbourne, I think, as I recall, was on Labor Day. I'm not sure, and Coco's was on Memorial Day, and they might have been reversed. But the people from the other two areas of the county always went together, and they'd take their picnic lunches with them, and they'd have picnics, and they'd have boat races, and they'd have foot races, and all types of things. Big family entertainment. You always look forward to those three events, which usually, of course, fell in the summertime or the warmer months. But those were big.
What would you do for the 4th of July?
4th of July? Oh, you'd always work out some things to have some fireworks, personal fireworks. You never had any big glamorous fireworks, that type of thing. But some of you always have a few fireworks. We'd usually always have a parade and decorate up bicycles, and in the older times decorate up buggies, horse and buggies. And there was a lot of decorating of buildings through use of bunting and that type of thing. 4th of July was a big day, and most of our activities, as I say, centered on the river and at Sand Point. Sand Point, we had old baseball games, and there was a little horse track out there, and we had these kids games, all the type of kids games, and usually a big fish fry. Now, that was the important thing, a big fish fry, and if you didn't bring your picnic lunch, well, you ate mullet. And so 4th of July was a big day in Titusville.
How many people do you think would come to these things?
Oh, you might have I don't know, 1,500, 1,000, 1,500, maybe as many as 2,000, just depending on the weather and the program that you were having. They used to have some pretty good programs for those type of things.
Would there be speakers?
Sometimes they'd have speakers. You know, every once in a while, some attorney would be arranged to have him make a patriotic speech, or you might be able to have a visiting politician or something do that. Okay. And then they usually had a town band. That was something I didn't mention. The town bands would play a musical concert on the 4th of July and other times. We, as far as entertainment goes, we had a band here, a town band for many years that played in a little band performing area, and played usually maybe once or twice a month on Sunday afternoons. So that was a Sunday afternoon thing that people went to. They were always free.
Sounds like
life was simple. Life was a lot simpler.
That's for sure. You mentioned a little while back about the Depression times and bank failures. What was it like here then?
Well, life in the Depression was pretty tough, and I think about bank failure. I know my mother died a couple of years ago at the age of 100, and she lived through the Depression. And I know she always kept a little money around the house, because she said when the banks failed, when the local banks failed, she and my dad only had about $12 to their name, and she was never going to get caught like that again without any money, because she never did trust banks too much after that. But a lot of people didn't, and then of course in the Depression there was not a lot of money floating around, and we did some bartering. We think of bartering maybe in a different aspect than this, but this was bartering. For example, we were in the newspaper business, and we would trade advertising for groceries, and maybe trade advertising for other types of products. If a fisherman wanted a subscription to the paper, we might take fish, for example, and make a deal with him supplying us a certain amount of fish over a period of time. Farmers, we would take their products for subscriptions to the newspaper. And all other businesses did the same. There was just not a lot of cash money changed hands in those days, because there wasn't much cash. And I remember talking with a man in the 50s, and we were talking about that the price of bread in that time had gone up to like 40 or 50 cents a loaf, and he said he could remember when a loaf of bread was only a nickel or a dime, but you didn't have the nickel or a dime. So everything's relative. But life was pretty tough here during the Depression days, and it wasn't until the latter part of the Depression that this area seemed to come out of it. One thing that we had during the Depression that made an impact on Titusville was WPA, the Works Progress Administration. A lot of people can remember back and think those people didn't accomplish much. They were standing around leaning on their shovels and so forth. They didn't do that in Titusville, and it was primarily because of the people in charge of the program. We have a lot of things today because of the WPA workers here. For example, the Titusville Marina was constructed in that day and age, and the coquina rocks that lined the walls of the marina there were brought in and placed there by WPA workers. That was one good result. We had a small band shell that was constructed, and several hundred park benches constructed during those days. Some of the benches that we find in Titusville in some areas might still be those benches. Not far from where we're talking today is the Babcock Furniture Building, which is just down a few doors. That was originally the Van Croy Theater building, which was built in 1928 and 29. The theater went broke, and so the building was left vacant, and the roof leaked, and during the early part of the Depression, that was in pretty bad shape. So there was a project came along, and the building was purchased by local people, and WPA, well, the local government, and WPA went in there and reconverted it into a basketball area. And so if you go into Babcock Furniture now, the larger parts, you can still, on the floor, on the wooden floor, see the stripes of the basketball court. That became quite a civic center and basketball area, playing area. And so that, we think of that as being a good thing that happened during those WPA days and the Depression days.
Well, just prior to that, I guess, in World War One, I don't know, you wouldn't necessarily have any personal memories
No,
of
I
this,
don't.
but do you have any stories you can tell us of?
Excuse me. I think I...
Really?
Robert Hudson, August 24th, 1992, North Brevard Historical Museum, Titusville, Florida. Interviewer Nancy Yasecko. Equipment Sony BVP-50. Camera, that's the camera. The Beta SP recorder Sony BVW-35. Audio on channels 2 and 4. Copyright Brevard County Historical Commission, 1992. This is tape 3.
Okay, we'll talk about the war years here.
Well, we could go back many years, of course. This area had some events during we go way back to the Seminole Indian Wars. You know, the Seminole Indians, one of their last stands was in this area, as an example, before they were at that time driven on south into the Everglades. Coming on up, we had in the Civil War, there was some activity here, war between the states or Civil War, however you want to term it. This was an area for salt production, and they would take large metal pans and pump the salt water from the Indian River in it, and then let the sun evaporate it and scrape the salt off of the bottom of the pan. And of course, salt was very important for keeping meat. This was also an area of some blockade running by the Confederate forces, bringing supplies in this way and going north. There was never any fighting in this area. Coming on up to the Spanish-American War, there was some activity here in the fact that the war was in Cuba, of course, and it was so relatively close to Florida that in a lot of communities they established guard groups, and here they called it the Indian River Guards, and they were ready to not go anywhere but just to protect this area in case Spain made an attempt to invade Florida. World War I activity here primarily was revolved around a Coast Guard station that was located just east of us here along the Atlantic coastline. There were, of course, a lot of young men went into the service, but that's a primary activity during World War I, a lot of Coast Guard activity in the area. World War II, of which I'm a little more familiar with since I served in World War II, but this area, there were a lot of ships sunk off the shores of Brevard County, and that resulted in people in us having guards along the beaches area, because there were some German submarines had discharged some people to come ashore up in the Jacksonville area, and there was fear that might happen in this area. So you had beach patrols with dogs, and they had guard shacks, and then another check was on the bridges coming from the island into town. They had some guards in that area. That was the primary activity during World War II as far as personnel went. We did have quite a boat building industry here. The Correct Craft people came here and built a whole number of boats there in Central Florida, over in the Pine Castle, Orlando area now. But they built a lot of assault boats for the Army and Navy both. And then, of course, Banana River Naval Air Station came in, and we had some activity here. They had a USO unit here, and they would invite the young men that were stationed at Banana River Naval Air Station to come up for entertainments here. And we had a number of local girls that married young men that served there, and then they usually came back and lived here. But that primarily the activity during any wars that we've had.
I guess there are quite a few people who came here to Florida in general, but up and down the coast, who had been sort of stationed along here. And
yes, and that I guess they get used to the better weather maybe than they have in the northern areas, and so they usually come back and live here. Many of them do.
Did you say you served around here?
I was in the Navy, and the last 16 months of my service was at Banana River Naval Air Station, just 30-some miles from home. I was fortunate in that, I guess, although every month I put in for a transfer somewhere else because I like to have seen more of the world. But I was overseas in the Caribbean area in the anti-submarine patrol work, Caribbean and down South America, and then spent the last 16 months. I was in the Navy nearly 6 years, and I spent the last 16 months down here at what was then Banana River Naval Air Station, now Patrick Air Force Base.
tell us a little bit about the submarine activity.
Well, even before we got into World War II, there was quite a bit of German submarine activity against merchant ships along the East Coast. And I think there were probably somewhere, I've heard this figure, over 80 ships were sunk along the Florida East Coast because it's a natural transportation route for merchant ships. And they had a number of them. We had some stuff float ashore, and I can remember a local man who was gathered many barrels of oil that had floated ashore, for example, here. And those people who were here at the time could see the fires of the ships burning. Of course, another activity during the war was plane spotters. We had a civilian plane spotting operation on top of the courthouse. And that was I guess we all thought that maybe the enemy would bring airplanes here. We didn't know, but that was one of the ways to protect this area.
You were in the Caribbean. You were looking for these submarines.
Yes, there were activity. They were active in the Caribbean area against all type of shipments, and the number of submarines were sunk in the Caribbean area by planes of our kind and by ships, warships.
What was the Banana River Naval Air Station like?
Well, it was it was just an air station primarily devoted to watercraft. I flew in PBMs, which landed on the water and then were pulled up on shore. That's what it was selected for because of the protection of the Banana River from the sea. It can be pretty rough landing such an aircraft at sea because of the swells, and you didn't have that in the river, and that was what it was used for. Also, it was a headquarters of local patrol, smaller planes patrolling and looking for these subs there. It was a training area. And while I was there, we were training other crews. That's what I spent the last 16 months doing, was being a instructor in navigation and for the crews that came through there. So it was a pretty good life, really. Not many naval air stations or Army places had a beautiful beach right in front of them, which it was. And although there was not the population, anywhere near the population that was here, the fact of the matter is, we speak of Banana River Naval Air Station, there was nothing south of it on the A1A. The road was built down to Melbourne, but there was nothing south on it till you got down to the O'Galley area. And it was just wild, just wilderness. Very few homes a few homes built in Cocoa Beach, but most everybody that was stationed there that was married lived in Cocoa or O'Galley or Melbourne. Others lived on the base. But gosh, it was a great place to serve. because a great beach and good weather and a lot of flying days. We didn't have much bad weather for flying.
I heard they had a radar program there. They were developing some.
They did, and a Loran navigation program too in the latter part of World War II. That was thought of by a lot of people as a possibility that this area might be attacked because of that base there. But there was little likelihood of it, but you always think of that and are wary of it.
Well, very good. Let's take a cut.
Well,
what about mosquitoes in this area?
Oh, they've always been a problem, much more in early days. I don't know how people lived here in the real early days. I don't know how they were living. I remember when we moved here, my mother and my sister and I came down by train from Cleveland, and never will forget getting off the train, and literally the mosquitoes just ate you up. You know, they were all over your arms and everything. So we were so anxious to get somewhere where they weren't bad. You can imagine people coming to this area like that. But mosquitoes were bad, and they were a problem. And the first mosquito control was cutting a swatch of palmetto, the palmetto fronds, and just using it like this to ward off the mosquitoes. And then other people burned, sometimes they'd burn rags or burn a powder, a mosquito powder, to keep them off. Didn't have air conditioning. Of course, screens were very necessary in that day and age. Even some people slept under mosquito netting in their homes because of that. But you can imagine how that would be in the middle of the summertime when it was pretty hot. Mosquito control came in at the latter stages of World War II when they first started the aerial spraying, and they did quite a bit of aerial spraying for that. And then later years, of course, they went through this process of diking and flooding the areas, and that is probably the most successful mosquito control program. You know, the mosquitoes will become, like anything else, will become immune to certain types of spray, and you've got to go on and get stronger, and then that affects people and affects other wildlife. So we have to be very careful of that. But the diking and that type of thing, making sure that your areas around your home they're not areas for mosquito breeding. Speaking about your home, a lot of people had their own mosquito control and a fogger on their lawnmower. And I had one, and we were able to control the mosquitoes around the plants and the shrubs around the house pretty much if you got out and mowed your yard at the same time you were given a mosquito control process. But they were bad, and I'm sure they were bad in the early days of the space program, because after all, the space program was located on North Merritt Island, which was one of the headquarters for the mosquitoes, and I'm sure it was very difficult. Of course, we got air conditioning, and so it wasn't quite so bad. But I'm sure that there was a mosquito problem there in the early days outside.
Tell me a little bit about what you did about mosquitoes there at work.
Well, at work, you have screen door. All the businesses had screen doors because you couldn't stand it in the summertime. Sometimes people would take the doors off in the wintertime and the fall and put them back on in the spring. But for example, at our newspaper office, where people were working at machines or maybe sitting and setting type, they had to have something. So we usually had an insect powder that they called it, that was burning around their legs or something like that, and that would keep the mosquitoes off. There's just no way to keep the mosquitoes from coming in with people through, as a result of the screens. So you did have a problem, and you'd sit there and type and swat a mosquito. We don't think of that nowadays, but it did interrupt you a lot, and it made it very uncomfortable.
Okay. One of the biggest changes that happened around here happened when the space program came.
That probably is the most dramatic change we've ever had in Titusville, when the space program came, and particularly after the NASA acquired all of the property, some 100,000 acres of property east of us here, which several things. It changed our life dramatically in that prior to that time, we had a beach that was available to the public at all times, and a lot of people in town had built cottages over there, primarily cottages for the summertime. A lot of people went and lived at the beach in the summertime, and we have a map behind me here that shows some of those cottages, or aerial photograph. They did that, and the big problem was water. Water was good drinking water was hard to obtain there, but they did, and there was a number of cottages over there. Of course, when the Space Center purchased that property, that cut that out, and Titusville became virtually an inland community, even though it was on the coast. No direct availability of the Atlantic coast until such time as the wildlife people and the seashore people came in, and that is available to the public at all times, except when there are anticipation of missile launches, shuttle launches, and landings. But the advent of the space program here dramatically changed the community. For one thing, we had 3 communities in this area before the space program came. We had Titusville was incorporated, and the little town of Whispering Hills to the west was incorporated, and south was an Indian River City area, which was unincorporated, but was seeking incorporation. So it was determined that these 3 would go together, and so overnight the population jumped from about 6,000 to about 20,000, and that was one of the effects of the space program, the buildup. We prided ourselves in North Brevard as being a bedroom community for the space program. And we, although the glamorous part of Cocoa Beach, and I'm not saying anything about that, but that was more of a glamorous area, more motels, more of the corporations brought their people in, living there to work at the Space Center. But we tried to attract families, and that was the big thing in North Brevard, because so many of our churches worked hard to attract families. Our schools, life was a little bit slower here than it was at Cocoa Beach, and so we tended to attract the family atmosphere, whereas maybe the singles and other families, of course, lived throughout the county. That did a lot for our community build-up. And then, of course, at the end of the space program in the mid-'70s, we really hurt, and there were at times during the cutback, people just had to leave the community, left their houses, couldn't sell them, so they just left them and let the financial institutions take them back. In many cases, FHA had to take back these houses, and we at one time during that period had as many as 600 or 700 homes empty and available. Well, we began an advertising program to point out that these were available at very reduced prices. So it was pretty successful in that our first influx after that was from South Florida. Many people down there selling their homes for bigger prices and coming up here and buying what we might call bargain prices. And so a lot of those homes were filled that way. We were determined after that cutback that we would try to diversify so that we were not dependent on the space program as much as we were in the past. And some of the ones that have come in since then, McDonnell Douglas's operation here there are 2 operations. One's related directly to space, and another larger operation is involved with the Tomahawk missile and component parts for airplanes. And there is quite a diversity of other types of industry here now, non-space related, and that's what we had hoped to do, because we'd never like to go through the same thing we did about 17 years ago, and that was a real downturn. That hurt everybody.
Okay.
But of course, we'll think about it. There's the thrilling part of the shuttle, the thrilling part of the Apollo launches. The launch when man first went to the moon was probably just the most thrilling thing that people in this area had ever seen. It was so fascinating that before the launch we had people literally camping everywhere along the Indian River, along the causeway. Everything was filled. We had people sleeping on blankets in the median between the two lanes of US 1 even, which was very dangerous, but that was the way it was. And our facilities were really taxed to the limit. That was mainly in the days of the Apollo program. Since then, the shuttle launches have also brought many people. We have more facilities, more areas for people to view and watch, and then of course they have a better policy for allowing people to park along the NASA Causeway and the causeway leading to the Air Force Station, as well as many people viewing it from the launch area itself. But those were thrilling days. They still are. We still get thrilled at watching shuttle launches go, and nighttime launches in particular are so dramatic. But it's changed us forever. It'll never be the same. We wouldn't want it to be the same.
With the change in your population, people coming in for the space program, wasn't too long after that there was a change in the newspaper business.
Oh yes, we had quite a change in the newspaper business. The Star Advocate, of which I was associated with all these years, had grown before that. Well, we were a twice-a-week newspaper, and then in the late 50s, as the build-up started, we went to 3 times a week, and then in 1964 we changed to an afternoon daily newspaper. And the following year, Gannett Company, which they bought the Cocoa Tribune, and then we sold to them, our paper sold to them, and then they started the Today newspaper, which later has become Florida Today. I stayed with the company after we sold. So I was with them from 1965 till 1985 when I retired. I was with them 20 years. Very dramatic change in the newspapers. During that time, of course, we gained radio stations and eventually television stations. And the first television station that we could get in this area was in Jacksonville. And I had a tall tower at my house and a small screen, and we would get a rather snowy picture, but we got our first January 1st bowl games and other types of entertainment. We were real pleased with it, and of course it improved so much now with the television stations much nearer. The view we're seeing here is Washington Avenue looking north about 1900. Shows a couple of bicycle riders in the middle of the street, unpaved street. To the left is the Florida Star building, the first building. Beyond that, with the tower there, is the Advocate building, and others are grocery stores and a couple of department stores. This is another view of Washington Avenue looking north. About the same view as we had before. However, now we have automobiles in here. This was in the late 20s. More buildings, more 2-story buildings. And Washington Avenue has filled in a great deal than since the earlier picture. This is the Dixie Hotel, which is on the site of the old Titus House, right on the Indian River. It was originally a 1-story building, and then they built this 3-story structure overlooking the Indian River. This is the view along the Indian River in Titusville. You can see the docks that jut out into the river. Young lady there sitting on a seawall. This is probably in about the 1920s or early 30s, even maybe earlier than the 1920s. It's hard to tell from this postcard. This is a scene along the Dixie Highway through Brevard County. The highway ran pretty close to the Indian River, and you can see all the moss draped off the trees. The old car moving along there. It's the bridge over the Indian River in Titusville, named the Walker Bridge. It was built in 1922, connecting the North Merritt Island with Titusville.
You remember going across that bridge?
Many times.
You remember waiting for it?
Oh yeah, It was operated by hand. Hand crank would open that bridge for river traffic.
Was there a bridge tender station there? Or?
Mm-hmm. There was a house later built there, but I don't know what they did in the beginning. They just had somebody living nearby or something that went out there. Celebration in Titusville on July 4th, 1912. The decorated horse and buggy and the decorated bicycles there. That was a big event in Titusville on July 4th every year for many years.
Did you ever decorate your bicycle?
No. No, I never decorated a bicycle.
Rolling.
This is Dummett Castle, located on North Merritt Island behind what is now the NASA Space Center. It was a site of the first orange grove built in this area, or it was raised in this area. Colonel Douglas Dummett planted this grove, and he is thought, as a result of that, to be the father of the Indian River citrus industry.
What happened to that old house?
It burned down. It was moved onto the causeway here after NASA bought the property, and that's the way it looked. And really, they couldn't move it across the bridge, so they parked it on the causeway, and then while they were waiting on a barge, it burned down.
This wasn't Dummett's house.
No, not. It was on the side of his place.
Yeah, it was on the side of his
I don't
place.
know that he.
Popularly known as Dummett Castle, but he didn't build it.
Rolling.
The picture shows the newer bridge across the Indian River here with the draw span open. The older portion of the bridge is in the foreground. That's part of the old wooden bridge. They left that there for a fishing pier.
I see there's some information about the tolls. I didn't realize it had always been a toll bridge.
No, it was only a toll bridge in the early days. And you can see that that was in the days of when the bridge was wooden. It was 5 cents a nickel to go across per person. A horse and rider was 15 cents. A horse and vehicle and driver were 20 cents. And it went on down to where it cost 75 cents for trucks to go across.
Okay, rolling.
Picture of Miss Universe and Miss USA, who were here for an annual Christmas parade sponsored by the Titusville Jaycees. The prior year we had Miss America here, and they were here for that special occasion, which was the honored guest at the Christmas parade.
What year was that?
In the 60s, I'm not sure which year. Pianist Count Basie, very popular entertainer. He was here for a dance at Royal Oak Country Club. This was about 1970.
Rolling.
St. Gabriel's was Titusville. St. Gabriel's Episcopal Church, Titusville's first church. It was founded in 1886 and was built on land that was donated by Mrs. Titus, Mrs. Henry Titus, and also built with donations made to the church from a basket on board the steamers that moved up and down the Indian River, asking donations to build the first church in Titusville.
When's that picture taken, you think?
That was taken 1927.
Rolling.
Myers Cottage, a forerunner of bed and breakfast, but better known as a rooming and boarding house, located on Julia Street. This picture was taken July 4th, 1912, with people who were either eating the lunch there or were there to spend the holiday period of July 4th.
Can you zoom in?
Palm Hotel and Apartments, another of the hotels built along Julia Street which led from the railroad station down to the Dixie Hotel on the Indian River. This building was built in the 1920s, typical of the Spanish-type architecture of that day. When the Flagler Railroad was extended into this area and all along the East Coast, workers were housed in this type of quarter, called a quarter boat, which is housing aboard a large barge, moved down along the Indian River as the workers continued to build the railroad on south. And this is typical of the way they were housed, because there were no facilities for them to be located as they went and built the railroad.
Rolling.
First railroad station of the Flagler Railroad in Titusville. It was built when the trains first came in, and that was in the early 1890s, located right alongside the one track. Later, the railroad was expanded to dual tracks through this area.
Is that a northbound or southbound train?
It's a southbound train coming in.
What color was the station?
And the station was yellow and trimmed in white. Those were Flagler colors for all his stations.